Well, I don't know if you caught this story in the news. Did you see this? A truck loaded with thousands of copies of rosés, thesauruses, crashed yesterday, losing its entire load. Did you see this in the news? It was astounding. Witnesses were stunned, startled, aghast, taken back, stupefied, confused, shocked, rattled, dazed, bewildered, mixed up, surprised, awed, dumbfounded, flabbergasted, astounded, amazed, confounded, astonished, overwhelmed, horrified, numb, speechless, and perplexed. Meanwhile, those waiting for the shipment were at a loss for words. A couple of months ago, Monday, March 30th, former Purdue player, NBA star Jaden Ivey posted a video of himself on social media calling out the NBA for promoting Pride Month. A portion of his statement went like this. He said, "The world proclaims LGBTQ, right? They proclaim Pride Month, and the NBA does too. They show it to the world. They say, 'Come join us for Pride Month to celebrate unrighteousness.' They proclaim it on the billboards. They proclaim it on the streets. Unrighteousness." It was only a few hours later that the Chicago Bulls announced that they were releasing Ivey for conduct detrimental to the team. Now, some have insisted there were multiple reasons for Ivey's dismissal. And yet, at the end of the day, the timing and messaging of the Chicago Bulls' decision appears to come down to Jaden Ivey's Christian convictions. It could be a little question. We live in challenging days, and the cost of speaking truth is increasing exponentially. And yet we are morally bound as God's people to take a stand for righteousness. One of the best examples of that in the Bible is a young lady named Hadassah. She had the courage to speak up, even though it could have easily cost her her life. You're probably more familiar with her Persian name, that of Esther. We're going to examine her story this morning. If you'd like to turn in your Bibles, head that direction. That's where we'll be dropping anchor. Specifically, Esther chapters 3 and 4 will be our main target. It's about a third way through the Old Testament, just past Nehemiah. If you get to Job and Psalms, then you've gone too far. It's an incredible story, and like I said, we'll be spending the majority of our time this morning in two chapters 3 and 4. We're about halfway home in this sermon series we're calling Heroes and Zeros. We're studying a number of different Bible characters, many who will inspire us and motivate us to live godly lives, and then occasionally we'll touch on some zeros who actually warn us of danger. As we begin our study today, allow me to do a fast flyover. I want to make sure that you're aware of where we're at on the biblical timeline. If you were to draw a line between Esther and Job, and then another one between Song of Songs and Isaiah, you would have the three main divisions of the Old Testament. And so the first 17 books are considered historical. They contain the storyline of the Old Testament. The next 5 are poetry books. And the last 17 are prophetic. The characters we've studied thus far in this series would fall mainly in this era right here. So roughly 1500 to 1000 BC. But today we're all the way down here. We're at the very end of the spectrum. We're at the end of the Old Testament storyline. It's a storyline that goes like this. God led his people out of slavery in Egypt into their own promised land. He developed them into a mighty nation, and yet they didn't keep up their end of the bargain, did they? They worshiped the false gods of their pagan neighbors, for which they were punished and led into captivity. The northern kingdom was crushed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The southern kingdom was taken captive by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And at that point, you might be tempted to conclude, well, I guess that's it. I guess that's the end of the story. But no, God did not give up on his people, and so after 70 years of living in exile, God moved in the heart of King Cyrus to allow his people to return and rebuild. Roughly 50,000 people, 50,000 Jews chose to do so, but there were actually another 1 million who stayed in Persia. The events we're about to study tell us what life was like in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, during the reign of King Xerxes around 483 BC. If the book of Ruth can be called the Hallmark channel of the Bible, as I mentioned to you last Sunday, then the book of Esther might well be considered the Disney Channel. Because what it contains is a Cinderella story of a Jewish orphan girl who rises to become the queen of the powerful nation of Persia. This would, of course, be the pre-woke version of the Disney Channel, right? Much like we saw last Sunday in the book of Ruth, there's repeated evidence of the providence of God displayed in these pages. I shared with you last week, divine providence is the governance of God by which He, with wisdom and love, cares for and directs all things in the universe. Providence is the idea that God uses natural events to bring about supernatural results. Things happen in life, and God uses all those things to work out His plan. Remember, as I mentioned last week, the name of God is not found anywhere in the book of Esther. It's one of the unique things about this particular book. The name of God is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. And yet, as we shall see shortly here, His hand can be clearly seen, moving and working behind the scenes. We're at that point where if you picked up an outline on your way into the service this morning, we can start filling in some of those blanks. I'll also give you some additional references as we move through our study today. But let's start with the danger. As chapter 3 opens, we're introduced to a vile man by the name of Haman. Haman has just been promoted to the highest position under the king of Persia, the chief minister of King Xerxes. But apparently the promotion went straight to his head. In fact, Haman's ego gets so inflated that on one occasion, when one of the royal officials named Mordecai, who just happens to be Esther's cousin and the man who raised her, when Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, he goes ballistic. He gets so angry that he not only determined to kill Mordecai, but when he discovers that Mordecai is a Jew, he's bent on destroying the entire race. Pick it up at verse 8. Haman said to King Xerxes, "There's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and he gave it to Haman. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Let's take just a second to reflect on that statement that was in the middle of those verses. Let a decree be issued to destroy them. Those are chilling words. In Haman's day, it was the Jews who were under attack. And of course, we're witnessing the same in our world today, aren't we? With this rise of anti-Semitism. But this morning I want to focus on another group in the crosshairs, namely those who profess allegiance to Jesus Christ. In one sense, it probably shouldn't surprise us. We've discussed this on other occasions, but George Barna and his Cultural Research Center are now telling us that just 4% of our American population has a biblical worldview. And the numbers among our younger generations are even more startling. Look at this. Among millennials, ages 23 through 41, that number is down to 2%. What about Gen Z, 18 through 22? It's a mere 1%. Based on those kinds of percentages, it's only logical to conclude that the vast majority of our population is not going to support biblical values. They're not going to hold dear what we hold dear. But it's not just the fact that our culture rejects our values. They're also becoming increasingly hateful and antagonistic towards us. I received an email from Gary Bauer. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He's with the Dobson Family Institute. In that email, he shared what he called an earth-shattering report showing anti-Christian bias in our federal government. fact, Bauer called it one of the most consequential documents ever published. It's entitled Eradicating Anti-Christian Bias Within the Federal Government, and was issued by a task force chaired by Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. I opened the document, I opened the report, I thought, it's probably about 12 to 15 pages long, right? Maybe 20 at the most. There's 565 pages to this document. You can look it up yourself, or I'll try to remember to include the link in the midweek email if you want to read a portion of it. But let me just give you some of the things that this report revealed. The task force discovered that the Justice Department under the previous administration worked with radical pro-abortion groups to aggressively prosecute and persecute pro-life activists. They threw the book at Christians, peacefully demonstrating to protect innocent life. They also learned that the federal prosecutors aggressively filed multiple charges with withheld evidence in some cases, tried to prevent Christians from serving on juries, sought prison terms twice as long as those imposed on pro-abortion offenders who attacked crisis pregnancy centers or churches. The task force revealed that the previous administration used the Department of Education to force transgender ideology on our schools. They even went so far as to threaten to cut off school lunches for poor children if a school district resisted its transgender mandates. Christian parents at school board meetings were concerned about LGBTQ indoctrination, were spied on by the FBI, as well as conservative churches. The task force also stated that the previous administration took two concepts that we hold dear, loving Jesus and loving America, and turned them into a rhetorical smear by labeling us Christian nationalists. Such is a portion, but you get the idea. In summarizing the report, Gary Bauer said this: the media does not want the conclusions of this report to be widely understood. Sadly, many Christians have been like the proverbial frog in the slowly boiling pot. They were in denial about what was being done to them. We were very close to losing everything we hold dear. And then he actually concludes by stating that everything the report cites and condemns is still happening, not so much at the federal level right now, but under left-wing governors and mayors. He said this: every place where there is progressive socialist control, they are continuing to wage war against Christian religious liberty and attempting to intimidate Christians into silence while they redouble their efforts to indoctrinate our children. Again, at the end of the day, this really shouldn't surprise us. Think about it. On one occasion, Jesus called his 12 disciples together. He was preparing them to go out on a mission, right? He gave them authority to cast out unclean spirits and to heal every disease and affliction. But he also told them what to expect on that mission, didn't he? And so he warned that they would be handed over to local councils and that they would even be flogged in the synagogues. He indicated to them that family members would betray each other and have one another put to death. He made it clear that he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And in that same context, he bluntly said, hey, you are going to be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. You will be hated by all. Why? For my name's sake. Later in John 15, we learn if you belong to the world, again, the words of Jesus here, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you don't belong to the world. I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. I don't know how you can miss it. It's so clear. There it is in black and white. And we need to understand that ultimately it's not Christians that the world hates, but God and his truth. And we are just his messengers. And so when we take a stand on that truth, when we declare it to be accurate and reliable and true, we can expect pushback. That's the danger. And it's somewhat what Esther and her people are experiencing here in our study this morning. We've looked at the danger. Let's talk about the dilemma. Mordecai's reaction to Haman's plot is recorded in the opening verses now of chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. but he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Well, just as you would expect, with that kind of response among her people, it isn't long before it comes to the attention of Queen Esther that her people are in distress. And so she actually sends a messenger to Mordecai in order to get the details. We'll pick it up at verse 7, chapter 4. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. I'm sure you can see it there. Mordecai is asking for help. He's essentially saying, this is not right. This is evil. Esther, you need to do something about this. Of course, Esther's initial reaction was one of uncertainty. She's in a quandary. Her attitude is one of, well, I'm not so sure I want to get involved in this. You see, King Xerxes had a very strict policy on unwanted guests. And so she actually instructs her messenger to go back to Mordecai and tell him this. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. So you see what's happening, right? Esther's prepared to sit this one out. After all, she's the queen. She could jeopardize her own life. Why would she risk her neck over an issue that's not affecting her directly? And I guess you could say, in one sense, the same choice confronts us today. I think Tim Keller got it right here when he said this: to be faithful as Christians, wherever you are in culture, you have to be willing to lose the palace. You have to be willing to lose the palace. In other words, are we willing to sacrifice our comfort for the sake of truth? The fact is, truth is under attack in our day. Its enemies are relentless. Unfortunately, too many believers seem to be secret agent Christians who are determined to never blow their cover. Here's the reality, gang. Many believers have little or no impact on their world for Christ or biblical values. They have that disease that Dr. Walter Martin called non-rockabotus, right? Don't make waves. Don't stir the pot. Keep your head down. And so they clam up and they keep their faith to themselves. You see, they're afraid if they speak up for Christ, they may offend somebody or perhaps even be ridiculed or embarrassed. Sadly, many churches are adhering to that same strategy. Many churches essentially say, just preach the gospel. Keep it upbeat. Stay positive. Keep it encouraging. I'll tell you what, I have no problem with encouraging sermons. In fact, I actually attempted to share one last Sunday on Mother's Day. Every now and then I try to do that. But I also firmly believe that we have to be honest with what's going on in the world around us. That's why last fall, following the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we had this special showing of Truth Rising. That documentary exposes the civilizational moment that we are living in. If you've never watched it, I would encourage you to do so. It's actually still online. You can go to the website, truthrising.com, and you can even search for it on YouTube and bring it up. It's free, very motivating. Remember, the film highlights 4 courageous voices, right? Seth Dillon, Chloe Cole, Jack Phillips, Katie Faust. And they demonstrate how ordinary people can make an extraordinary impact when they boldly choose courage over fear. And they continue to do so. Actually, I saw an article just within the last couple of days that Chloe Cole had to cancel one of her events because of death threats. Not so much fearing for her own life as for those around her. And yet they continue to be those courageous voices in our culture today. And that's exactly what our hero does here this morning. So we've talked about the danger, we've talked about the dilemma, and finally, let's talk a little bit about the decision. Sometimes we need to help people see the logical conclusions to their rationalizations. And that's precisely what Mordecai does with Esther here. In fact, this is one of the greatest speeches that you'll find anywhere in the Bible. Look at his response here. He's talking to Esther, and he says, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this." It's a powerful argument. Mordecai convinces Esther that God has placed her as queen for this moment. Her position was no accident, but an act of divine providence in preparation for this attack on her people. Mordecai is confident that God is sovereign. He's well acquainted with God's covenant promise to his people. Mordecai is convinced that the Lord will deliver his people, that he has a plan that he will fulfill, even if by some other means than Esther. But there's also a warning there, isn't there? If Esther does not exercise her individual responsibility, she and her family will face consequences. So what does that tell us today? Well, I believe it tells us that there's a unique relationship between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. This much we can say with certainty. God expects his people to act. God expects his people to boldly stand on truth. God expects his people in times of crisis to depend on him and to courageously do the right thing. And Esther ultimately came to that conclusion. Look at it in verses 15 and 16. The queen calls for a national fast among her people. We can assume that fasting here was combined with prayer. And so even with her providentially provided position, look at it, Esther still relying on the Lord. She recognizes that the battle is his. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." There comes a point when every one of us must decide and respond much like this young queen. Make no mistake about it, taking a stand for truth is costly. There is a sacrifice involved. Doing the right thing can result in persecution and suffering. In Esther's case, she was called to put her life on the line, and yet she stepped up and answered Mordecai's challenge. She chose a course of action for the sake of her oppressed people that was incredibly risky. I'm personally convinced that we can do no less in our day. You know, it wasn't just true for the Jews in Esther's day. Jesus made it clear that it's also true for us who claim to be his followers today. Look at it. He stated it very precisely in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't he? He said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And what comes next? You remember what follows that section in verse 13? Jesus goes on to say, you yourselves, and that's emphatic in the original language there, you yourselves are the salt of the earth. And that's followed by verse 14. Remember what verse 14, what it says? I would think you'd be familiar with it. Jesus says, "You yourselves are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden." Have you heard that text before? What are those verses telling us? God intends for us to preserve We're to be salt. We're to protect against the decay. We're to push back against it. And not only that, he wants us to shine, doesn't he? He wants us to declare truth and expose darkness for what it is. If you're wondering how it all played out for Esther, the answer really comes in the first few verses of chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance, and when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. I wish I had time this morning to review the dramatic turn of events that transpired next. I hope maybe I'll motivate you to go home and read the rest of the book of Esther this afternoon. Suffice it to say that Esther ultimately exposed Haman's evil plot. She pleads for the king's intervention on behalf of her people. Xerxes, in fact, grants her wish. Haman is hanged, ironically, on the very scaffold that he had built for Mordecai to be hanged. And not only that, but God, by his providence, by God's providence, Mordecai, in turn, is elevated to a place of honor next to the king, and God's people, the Jews, are miraculously spared. So does that mean that there's always going to be a positive outcome? No, it doesn't. But this much we can safely say. There's one thing to do always and in every situation. Do what is right and leave the outcome in God's hands. Or somebody put it like this: there are two significant days in every life: the day you were born and the day you discover what you were born for. This is the day that Esther discovered what she was born for. And now it's our time. It's our time to discover what we were born for. Acts 17 puts it like this: from one man God made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he, God, marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. I take that to mean this: God has chosen each and every one of us to live now. These crazy days. You ever thought about that? God selected you to live in this era, at this moment in history, to accomplish his eternal purposes. We're not here now by some mistake. God has ordained that we be born when we were born and where we're born to do the work that he's prepared for us in advance for his glory. Gang, that is an unimaginable privilege. We've been given the glorious assignment of pointing our fellow Americans, indeed the whole world, to the greatness of our God and the validity of his truth. The question is, will we accept that challenge? Will we step up and courageously proclaim truth? I've shared this verse with you before, but it's one that continues to, I marinate on this one pretty regularly out of Daniel chapter 11. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. God help us to be included in that number in these days. We're going to conclude this morning by singing of God's greatness. A worship song that celebrates the fact that God is with us. It tells us he will go before, he will never leave us, he will never fail us. I said it at the outset of the service. We talk about courage. It's not our abilities. It's not our skills. We go depending upon the Lord and his greatness. Can we stand, sing together?